Well, here's a description of the drugs crisis that's affecting our communities. It's devastating, it's destructive for individuals, for families, communities, for society in general. Now, those words are the words of both former and current Taoiseach and ministers in this country. So they're recognising the problem we have, but they're not addressing it. We have the words, we don't have the action.
In these areas, the recent cutbacks are a disaster as well, because all the support services and the extra support that were put in during the boom times were now removed, as if the problems were solved. The only reason they're removed is, again, economic reasons. It's about short-term money and saving money with a long-term negative consequence that the young people today will provide huge and present huge difficulties in the future.
Well, what you have with the community drugs problem is you have a whole range of impacts all concentrated in a particular area, and the resources not being there to deal with it. And it impacts on every single person in the community.
When you're in a poorer area where it's run down, where housing isn't so great, where hope isn't always as readily available, where the social capital to help you achieve the things that you want to achieve isn't there, that drugs and addiction will take hold.
If you see very little prospects for your future, if you haven't had a very good education, if you're living in a community where drugs are in your face, then there is a greater possibility of you becoming addicted to drugs, and that then becomes a major problem in marginalised communities.
The drug dealing is open again. We see it happening on the street. For a while it seemed to have moved off the streets. It wasn't as visible. It is visible now again. We have the absolutely shattering level of health problems and deaths that are happening in our communities. What's shocking about it, I suppose, is the age, the relatively young age of the people whose health is being destroyed, who are dying. We have over 600 people a year dying from drug-related causes.
We're very much a them and us society. People who use drugs are them, not us. People who die in road accidents are us. And it could be any of us. People who die from drug overdoses or drug-related are them, and it's not us. And so you push the problem somewhere else.
So the kind of impacts we see, first of all, it's the availability and the range of drugs available. It's constant since the 80s that we've availability of drugs, but the range of drugs, that's a big change now. There's a lot wider range of drugs available, both legal drugs, illegal drugs, alcohol, the whole mix together. And that's kind of a chaotic mix that's adding to the problems and the impact in the community.
We've seen the increase in tablet use, increase in cocaine use, the introduction of crack cocaine. Then through head shops, we've seen the wide use of cannabis, continued growth in and availability through internet, the number of tablets that are on the street. So at this stage, we're at a position where polydrug use is the norm, where people are using more than one substance and they're addicted to more than one substance.
We have it at the time of one of the worst housing crises that we've ever faced in the country. We have housing which nobody wants to take anymore because there are certain areas that are just seen as kind of hotspots for drug problems and people don't want to live there. At the same time, in terms of the general environment, community spaces, we have examples like benches been taken away in parks or along canals because people see, well, drug users are going to gather there and it's going to be a problem. Massive problem which wasn't there back in the 80s or 90s of intimidation and fear. A huge level of intimidation and violence now going with the whole kind of drugs business. Same time as communities are experiencing all this negative impact, what do we see? We see the resources that were always there to support communities, to develop their capacity to try and respond to what's going on in their areas. Those resources have been taken away.
I think one of the first things we have to do is to look at the figures of what has happened. From 2008 to the end of 2013, government spending fell by about 7.1%. But what is interesting is if we look at the funding for voluntary and community organisations, that has fallen an average of minus 35%, a reduction in government spending of 35%, which is 5 times the rate at which its own spending has fallen. And government has never explained why why funding for voluntary and community organisations should fall 5 times greater than its own spending.
The community development programme, which was crucial to building support in communities. A lot of the leaders in the various drugs organisations across the city over the years have come through community development programmes and projects. That whole programme now has been hugely reduced. In areas the projects are gone altogether.
But in particular, if we look at disadvantaged communities, their funding has fallen by much more. Across the voluntary and community sector, health funding has been less affected, but funding for disadvantaged communities and the projects therein are down by something in the order of 45–50%.
It's very much a them and us, and as long as drug users are seen as they and not us, then I think it's going to be very difficult to change policies, because ultimately social policies are determined by attitudes.
During the 2000s, gradually the drugs issue slipped off the political agenda, slipped down the list as a political priority. And we didn't get to see that investment right through the 2000s, when we didn't have the excuse of no money, because the resources were there right through the Tiger years. And that brings us to the point where we are today, where now we do have still a devastating, a destructive drugs crisis in our local communities.